Welcome to our weekly panel discussion of the spring residency of the International Writing Program. We have a wonderful, distinguished lineup of writers, and if you're interested or watching at home for the writers' biographies, their samples of their work, and sometime after the panel, the presentations will all be there at iwp.uiowa.edu. The title of our panel today is Cultures in Conflict. What is the place of a writer, and more broadly of literary writing, in the ever more conflict-driven, often hostile social environments surrounding us? Can the tensions be ignored? Should they? And I'm saying that in the midst of the gathering evidence of war crimes in Ukraine, which have dominated the news for the last 50 days. Our first panelist, Tariro NDORO, is the author of the poetry collection Angringada, Like a Gringa, Like a Foreigner, which won the inaugural NAMA Award for Outstanding Poetry Book from Zimbabwe's National Arts Council. A finalist in several other poetry competitions, NDORO has had her work anthologized and translated widely. She lives in Harare and has earned a BS in microbiology as well as an MA in creative writing. Our next panelist joins us from Indonesia. Felix NESI is the author of People of Oetimo, which won the 2018 Jakarta Arts Council novel competition, and in 2016, the story collection Effort to Kill the Quiet. With the support of the Indonesian National Book Committee, he has researched the Timorese slavery in the Netherlands and is the founder of a street bookstore, a library, and a book festival, Kenkan Buku Fesek, all in West Timor. Mr. NESI, like each of our first three panelists, participates in this special spring residency courtesy of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Next to him is Raghavendra MADHU, author of 3 books of poetry, Make Me Some Love to Eat, Stick No Bills, and Being Non-Essential, all published by the Red River Press in New Delhi. He is the founder of Poetry Culture, a movement to create free spaces for poetry in many cities of India. He regularly curates events at the American Center Libraries in India and conducts performance poetry workshops for young adults. Our final panelist, Pamela RAHN SÁNCHEZ, is a graduate of the National Film School in Caracas, Venezuela, has published 4 poetry collections, The Light Between Things, Brief Poems to Understand Absence, which was the winner of the 2019 Gloria Fuentes International Young Poetry Award, Flowers and Vases Without Water, and The Danger of Turning on the Light. Her poetry, sometimes accompanied by her collages, also appears in anthologies and in print and online journals. She participates in this spring residency courtesy of a grant from the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. Please join me in welcoming these writers.
When 2 elephants struggle, it's the grass that suffers. This is a Kiswahili proverb. As a woman living in the global south or a third world country or an underserved population, the sociologists have many words for us. I've seen my people suffer, often from policies and wars that are not of their making. Yet somehow there is a burden to not only survive our struggle, but always to perform it. Thus, young African writers have a huge burden. Our forefathers created movements such as negritude and Pan-Africanism, and from there, they wrote against the colonial. Even after we freed ourselves from our colonial overlords, there remained an unspoken burden to perform our sufferings. Prestigious literary prizes reward books that describe acts of terror and stories of overcoming them, narratives that sometimes perpetuate harmful images about the Kalashnikov-carrying child soldier and the orphans forced into sex work at a very young age. These are the permitted versions of Africa in most bookshops. They are labeled Africana, but we in Africa refer to it as poverty porn, which Binyavanga Wainaina pointed out in his seminal blog post, How to Write About Africa. I say this because almost every bestseller in sub-Saharan Africa features some sort of violence, and perhaps we have normalized this narrative to the point where one cannot imagine better visionary futures in the style of Ursula Le Guin. I say this because most of my colleagues in the African literary communities already spend most of their time teaching and talking about Black pain. I say this because we would all rather write about unicorns. Yet despite this view that most African writers and scholars have about such literary works, we serve audiences who often expect us to tackle such issues, especially since writers such as Chenjerai Hove and Charles Mungoshi, who wrote against establishments out of necessity. And at each literary festival or reading I've attended, there have always been eager and young writers who ask, what is the writer's responsibility to culture? I'll tell a story. Once upon a time, a young Zimbabwean man started an online conversation in the guise of admiring my work. My writing technique was good, he said, but I was not political enough, and therefore I was not a Zimbabwean writer. I was just a writer who happened to be Zimbabwean. That is because I had chosen to focus my literary energy on critiquing the patriarchy by writing about dysfunctional families, instead of taking a hard partisan line and writing about politics. When the elephants have fought and bruised the grass, do they have a right to dictate how the grasslands respond? Are the writers and artists, particularly African writers and artists, obligated to focus solely on the world's wounds? My internal answer is this: no. Yet it is not a politically correct answer, so I tend to do what most politicians and poets do. I say many words that really mean nothing. However, in examining the place of artists in conflict or conflicted areas, I must split the writer into two. In an earlier panel session, the Brazilian screenwriter Luísa Fazio described her own two-faced tension between the playful muse and the shrewd marketer when it comes to the economics of writing. When it comes to cultures in conflicts, I describe a similar split, the artist and the human. The artist is playful and perceptive. The artist's only responsibility are to create art that is well-crafted and ingenious. It is not the artist, but the human who is obliged to respond to conflict. And how the human responds to such stimuli depends on so much more than ethnicity. The feelings of a 30-year-old man might be different from a 60-year-old woman, but does this delegitimize either of their stances? No. Whenever we force ourselves into political positions as authors, we're in danger of making bad or harmful art. But when we respond humanely to world events before responding artistically, we create art that is more sincere and thus more useful. And so we return to the central questions. Should tensions be ignored? The artist says maybe. Can they be ignored? The human says no. I was 24 years old when Black Easter occurred. Many listeners sitting in this venue do not know what that is. In 2015, there was a large population of undocumented immigrants living in South Africa when a Zimbabwean woman was lynched in the city of Durban. That sparked a wave of xenophobic violence across the entire country. At the time, I was living and studying in a quiet town in South Africa. Mentally, I knew I was safe from harm, but every day there were worse images on the news. To make things worse, I had just fallen in love with Latin American fiction, and the human in me was bombarded constantly by the feeling of homelessness. Okay, to go back to the Latin American fiction, a lot of it is about migration and identity. So I was bombarded constantly by the feeling of homelessness. That's when I sketched the first poems of my debut poetry collection. I was not attempting to write African literature. No, the artist in me was crying out in me because the human in me was deeply moved. The real question we should ask is, what else are artists doing? Because if we care deeply about our communities, we do not split hairs about what one should or shouldn't write. We are also enraged in engaged in the deep work of educating and organizing, signing petitions and supporting causes. Thus, the same Tariro who wrote poetry about immigration is the same Tariro who bought blankets and canned food for relief centers during Black Easter. As the Zimbabwean writer Dambudzo Marechera once said in response to the question, and do you simply observe and write? He answers, how can you observe a stone that is about to strike you? Because he understood that we do not write about struggle because we should. We write because we are human. And now, after rambling in the way of poets and politicians, I realize that perhaps I haven't answered the original question. What I'm trying to say is, as an African, I will continue to write depressive poetry about femicide and discrimination and racism and poverty, because I write from the grasslands, and the grasslands necessitate that. But honestly, I'd rather write about unicorns.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I grew up in West Timor, an island in the eastern part of Indonesia, in a small village near the border between Indonesia and East Timor. Sorry if you lost in these old places. I draw some map behind the paper. Yeah. Timor is far away from the capital city of Jakarta on Java Island, where the standardized knowledge and curriculum are produced. So when I started reading as a child, what I read were the stories about Jakarta and Java Island. And when I began writing at the age of 10, my short stories were about children in Java learning silat, Javanese martial arts, to catch a pickpocket in a train station, do detective things, etc. It is good for my imagination, but later, when I tried to be a real writer and got my first advice, begin the writing with what you know, I realized a big gap between what I wrote and what I live with, or even what I did really feel. And once I tried to get to know myself, I realized that my life in Timor is full of dramas and conflict, just like what is expected by most fictional readers. During my childhood, in the late 1990s to the early 20s, the financial crisis hit some Asian countries. Students struggled to overthrow the dictator regime in Indonesia, and East Timor, my very neighbor, struggled to gain independence from Indonesia. I later realized that while I was busy reading and writing stories about Java, the armed soldiers and militias built an outpost in my village, and the refugees who lost everything in the east fled to the village of West Timor, where the local government sheltered them. With the soldiers and militias walking around in the village, gunshots were a lullaby. Every 3 or 4 months, there were market shops or someone's house burned down by hysterical people for various reasons. At some point, we got used to the news of the killing. Someone was beheaded for the accusation of being a spy. UN employees were burned alive in the city square. A speeding army truck crashed into pedestrian, etc. Sometimes I wonder how I spent my time reading and writing about a faraway place while my people struggle with war, while there is a child inside of me terrified every time he sees a soldier or militia, long-haired men who bring guns everywhere they go. I then realized that what I have experienced is just a reflection of Indonesian literature. Indonesia had been decolonized in the 1940s, but they learned how to be the colonizer. The massacring, the kidnapping, the exiling, colonization of East Timor and West Papua through invasion and pseudo-referendums in the 60s and 70s. But until the end of the 80s, there was no writing on that event. Indonesian literature was busy producing pieces about apples on the table or a young man who became a bad guy after being an atheist. Meanwhile, the innocent farmers who had ever received fertilizer from the Communist Party, or the indigenous people who were not convinced of the so-called legal religion were accused of communism and being slashed in the front of churches. Not to mention, there is no Timor and Papua occupation in Indonesian literature. I forgive the 10-year-old me who writes about pickpockets in Java while someone inside him doesn't stop crying. But that ignorance of Indonesian literature, while more than 3 million people were killed for nothing, is miserable. The writers and intellectuals, their voices always count, and they really have to say something, in the writing or as simple as in some interviews. Then the question among some writers in Indonesia, and maybe among some writers in the world, is, does every writer have to be charged with the responsibility to make people or the readers aware of the injustice, conflict, and structural violence committed by their government? Can we just keep writing for the sake of the writing itself? If we keep talking about all the conflict, the sorrows, and all the dark side of history, then where is the fun part of writing? I can't really answer that question, and I assume if you are a writer, you will have the answer. But let me tell you my experience. As a young villager inherited by a complicated history of colonization, writing always helps me know myself better, meet all the wounds and pleasures, dreams and imperfections of me as a human being. And every time I meet all those parts of me, there's always a child crying deep in me, asking for the existence of his fears and traumas in my sentences. I wrote it down, and it ended with all the drama and conflict, all fun things that I myself wanted to read. And I can brag in front of my fellow writers from Java that I have so many stories with real drama to write, while they call out all the images to create a conflict about some aliens coming from the year 230 something and destroying the motherland. I always have a real drama to tell them. Your beloved country attacks my island, kills the men, rapes the women, and brought the children to Jakarta to teach them how to be a gangster. Sure, because those kids have scary faces with black skin and curly hair. And what's more fun? All that conflict was not fiction, but sometimes it feels more fictitious than the fiction itself. Thank you.
Conflict with the self in arts. Culture is discursively constructed, art is not. Though it may seem that art follows culture, it is indeed the culture that follows art. Considering the spatiotemporal sensitivities, culture is curated by the practices and discoveries of artists and artisans whose ideas have been adopted into our everyday lives. How the artists themselves arrive at what may, in the future, be a part of the culture is a complex internal and meditative process. The assimilation of the existing knowledge of the theories and practices in arts brings the artist to a point of choice they must make for their art's sake and about which school of ideas they wish to take forward. What is art? Personally, I examine and seek this statement every waking moment. Is this a question or an answer in itself, which leads to despair, and somehow that despair feels home of the art? Should I pick hibiscus, rose, or mallipu for a certain poem? What image should I choose, river or sea? The choice to wrestle with images before the writer settles for a certain one has personal, social, and political implications. There is a world of conflict in defining what constitutes the arts. Is it all about aesthetics? What about the intention of the artist? What about protest art? What is it about Duchamp's urinal fountain or Warhol's soup cans that changed the art game? For the purpose of my own writing, performance, and curation too, I believe that art has moved from appearance to conception, and it reflects in my work. Though I cannot say that is all I believe, there are no absolutes. Art is much like a river from Heraclitus' statement, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." The meaning of art itself is ever transient. Is art political or personal? All art reflects the political stance of the creator. I have come across many artists, in brackets in India, who express that they are apolitical. That itself is a political choice, my love, a ticket of privilege. I find myself closer to Lorca's words. The artist, and particularly the poet, is always an anarchist in the best sense of the word. An artist and a dear friend, Nilim Mohanto, got arrested last week in Arunachal Pradesh for making a huge mural saying "No more dams" on a government wall that already had a beautiful mural depicting all indigenous people of the region titled Wall of Harmony. Though he got released a few days ago due to support from the artist community and public, the question remains, did he defame the wall, or was he trying to make a point? On release, among the first things asked by a journalist was, "So going ahead, would you like to call yourself an artist or an activist?" What can poetry do? Page versus stage. I am somehow always inevitably interested in what poetry can do beyond a page. I find it okay on a page, but now that it's born, what can it birth? Auden famously said that poetry makes nothing happen, but there is no harm in hoping it can. The oral recitation of poetry has been universal in the world for centuries. The origin, evolution, and the process in which spoken word poetry has become a global phenomena and are radically distinct and relevant to the contemporary societal context. I have tried to practice my ideas of taking poetry into people's life by organizing over 100 poetry readings and art workshops in schools, colleges, juvenile correctional facilities, and community groups in urban and rural spaces of India. I curate nature poetry hikes in the woods and hills neighboring Guwahati as a mindful art engagement for anyone who wishes to step outside their stressful lives for a weekend. We just walk around quietly, find some quiet scenic spots, and read poems by Kabir, Raymond Carver, Langston Hughes, or Mary Oliver. The competing ideas of accessibility versus complexity of a poem also takes up some of the vast acres of my conflict in my mind. Should the poet be more inclusive or exclusive, complex or simple, direct or indirect with the use of language? Like many other countries, India has an ancient and rich culture of oral folk songs, stories, and poetry in their own regional languages. That means poetry has long been in some form or other in the daily lives of people, and I would love to see our everyday language and actions guided by poetry. At times, I exercise tremendous effort in keeping a poem simple and direct, but of course, not all poems seem to budge. The last lines of one of my poems support the premise of this idea. I write about little things so that every time I sit by the fire in some unknown village to share their food, and their children ask me to read poems, I don't want to tell them that they will not be able to understand what I write. One of my upcoming books of poems titled Trash Poetry is conceptualized around excessive consumerism and plastic waste. The poems written are in mixed medium, cutouts from everyday plastic waste, placed on a page juxtaposed with text. Is this poetry? Is this not poetry? Is this poem performing on a page? Only time can tell. The song for which Arooj Aftab got the Global Music Grammy 2022 comes from a poem by Hafiz Hoshiarpuri written in 1921. It has been sung by many great musicians in the past like Mehdi Hasan and Iqbal Bano. मोहब्बत करने वाले कम न होंगे, तेरी महफिल में लेकिन हम न होंगे. There will not be a dearth of lovers for you, but unfortunately, I will not be a part of the mehfil or the gathering or celebration. Maybe this is what I want for my work, to be sung again and again when I'm no more in this mehfil. I refuse to sit on a bookshelf. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. My panel is called The Exaltation of the Minimum. On my way to Iowa, I had a connecting flight from Atlanta. I went to the bathroom at the airport where I saw a very cheerful janitor doing her work. I remember that she was singing. Then I saw her drop something on the floor and joke with someone as I washed my hands. Then a woman came to appreciate her, telling her that her work was not easy and that she was doing it very well. Almost immediately after that, another woman said the same thing to her. I looked around and thought that I must be missing something. Was the bathroom particularly clean and sparkling? Or maybe it smelled really good? Was there some secret code that I did not know? I was an observer who saw it with a certain censorship. In a meeting of a conflict that did not belong to me, the American racial conflict. At first, what impressed me was that these women focused their attention on an invisible job. Unaccustomed to the idea that the gesture could simply contain kindness, I quickly concluded that since we were at Atlanta Airport, where the racial struggle is very vigorously exhibited, and the janitor was African American, there may be a sense of white guilt, since the two women were white. However, it was an attentive look that, no matter where it had come from, and a conscious decision to use language to affirm a simple but accurate reality, a clean bathroom. With that gesture, made only of words and good intention, a minimal gesture that contained a different closeness, different use of the human, erased in some way at that moment, of course, with a very thin and small pencil eraser, the tension of various cultural conflicts, both class and race, that have been in the United States for years. The role of the writer in culture is to exhibit the social from the intimate, so the reader can understand the identity of the other. From empathy and beauty, look around with enthusiasm and dare to name it. To build an open gaze on what goes unnoticed can be a political act. Name the invisible. Coming from a country like Venezuela, where even buying a bag of palm flour can become a political conflict, I've been asking myself if I should be a political writer. And at the same time, I've been a bit against the idea because I'm a rebel and because sometimes politicization leads to propaganda, and propaganda is an easy way to write bad poetry. I greatly admire Cuban writers who have gone through situations similar to those in my country and who had to fight against censorship. Nevertheless, they continue to write books in opposition to the prison of reason. Books as majestic as Before Night Falls by Reinaldo Arenas, against a regime, or they simply write to leave the darkness behind and flee, about the sea, about love, or about their mothers, while beneath them is nothing but fear and pain. The writer must be interested in conflict, but always from a personal point of view, not a massive one, or he loses the literary and becomes a pamphleteer. Conflicting cultures are understood when there is a common point. The role of the writer is to find that point in common with delicacy. Writing opens a metaphysical door that allowed us to understand the intersection of cultures, the intense adventure of having an identity, and consequently all the tensions generated around it. We are a bridge to get to information, using symbols and language, creating synchrony in a hostile world, not from the sinister, but the intimate. In that waiting room, I felt, with a certain ingenuity, of hope, that was beginning to write a different story, given by the exaltation of the minimum. Thanks.
presentations, I want to tell you about some upcoming events. Join us later today at 5 o'clock for our weekly Shamba House reading, this week featuring T.J. Benson from Nigeria, Sarah Jaramillo Klinkert from Colombia, and Aziz Arachidi from Morocco. Film enthusiasts will be interested in our next Cinema Tech event this Sunday at 6 o'clock in the Adler Journalism Building, room 105. We will be showing the film Bad Genius, presented by Jidanan Lee from Thailand. Next Tuesday, April 19th, join us for a special guest at Shamba House at 7 o'clock. We will be receiving an alum of our program, the editor, short story writer, screenwriter, and teacher Billy Kahura from Kenya. He'll be reading from his new volume of stories and talking about the short form in the context of the current literary climate in sub-Saharan Africa. On Thursday, we are pleased to present Resistance/Revolution in collaboration with the University of Iowa's Department of Dance. The IWP is bringing together writers and dance makers for an evening of performances. That'll be at 7:30 at the Space Place Theater in North Hall. And of course, next Friday, please come to join us for a discussion from the spring residency here at noon at the Iowa City Public Library. The panel is Nature on Edge. And with that, I'll open it up to questions, and please make sure we get the microphone that Javni has there so that the people at home can hear it, your questions.
Hello everyone, thanks for your great panels. Just a very basic question. Can you write without conflict? Because it seems like a very it seems a need because of all the writers, all the things you mentioned. Do you think you can write out something that's not out of conflict?
I think conflict is a huge part of all writing, whether it's fiction or poetry. But I think kind of approaching this paper or approaching this panel, I was asking myself questions about what sort of conflict, for instance. So if I write about conflict in a family, is that a legitimate story? And if I write a story that's about conflict within a country, is that a legitimate story? So I think at times people want to prescribe to say, conflict within a family is it's not a story that matters. You must only write about conflict within the country. And some people are like, no, we don't want to hear about conflict in the country. You must only write about conflict within the family. So I think that's what we're sort of fighting against, that you can't tell a writer which conflict to focus on. They focus on the conflict that's important to them. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, to answer your question, I think, I agree. A lot of writing can be without a conflict, yeah. But also this morning, I and Shehan were speaking to the Summer Institute students, and I think it's a thing in South Asia, the way to put it. At least I heard it from a Kashmiri writer. He heard it from Hanif, the writer Hanif. And so I think there's a saying that goes, I hate bad poetry. I hate good poetry because it means the times were bad. So, yeah, I think, I think definitely a lot of good work comes from conflict. But yeah, many of my writings are without conflict.
Yeah, and I think conflict can be like in the little things. You can write about your family, like Tariro said, you can write about unicorns. But if you are like, it's the voice, it's the person that writes the thing that actually made it interesting, and it don't have to be like important conflict. It could be minimal, but yeah.
Sorry, I'm about to add something about Tariro. I think what she's writing is so political. Like she's writing about the patriarchy and dysfunctional families. It's so political. So it's a big conflict. And I think conflict is, I think it's in every writing. It has to be a conflict. Otherwise, what's the point? Like, if you wrote about unicorns, that you have to build a conflict with the unicorns,
Yeah.
like what they eat, and they don't like to eat humans, but they are forced to eat human, something like that. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of what you said was about basically about writer responsibility and the pressure to be political as a writer. But taking cue from what Felix just said, even very apolitical writing can be read politically, right? So, so what do you think about that? Actually, to what extent is it fair or necessary or maybe inevitable to have a political reading of apolitical writing?
I think if you, like us, live in a country with really political things happening, you can write about anything and it could read politically. So, yes.
Totally. Perfect.
I think even if we write about the beautiful of the trees, I think there is some point have to be happening, like the leaves falling down to the graves, what is it? To the body, the dead people. Yeah, it's always happening. Like you look everywhere, and that's it. And conflict is everywhere. But what I always say is we write about our personal story, what we really feel, and it's conflict everywhere. So we don't feel like someone pressed us to write about something. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is a saying that says, once you've written your work and it's been published, it's now out there, and whoever's reading it is bringing their own context to your work. So there are different readings of it. But I'm going to go back to something Pamela said about if you try too hard to take a stance or a position, it ends up reading like propaganda or like a pamphlet. And that's sort of what we're trying to avoid. That you want to write something that has a human, a human bridge or a human element to it. And if someone reads that and says, "Well, I see this as an allegory for something else," I can't go to someone's house and shoot them for reading the wrong thing.
But I also have a small addition to make there. I mean, with all due respect, that part, the pamphleteering part, it is also in a way, the talk of a high art thing. And for me, that doesn't sit well, because who is going to sing for the revolution? That has to be words like, none of our lullabies that are sung to us as a child is like high literature, which you don't understand, It's in a way things that comfort you. And that is when your heart hit the most. A line of, an Auden's line saying that if equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. This is not greatest poetry on the face of the earth, but this is a comfort line which you can carry on the corners of your heart. Whenever you're most pained, there's a revolution, then you do. So yeah, I'm saying that is possible, and that is possible too. So yeah, the word pamphleteering might also be very academically pamphleteered. So yeah.
Yes. The American poet Stanley Kunitz, in the introduction to his selected poems late in his life, said that on the one hand, he rued the fact that he had not written very much about political issues. And then he remembered that to be a poet in America in the 20th century was in itself a political statement. And that might be a kind of a dodge, but I think it does give us another way to think about the writer's obligation in whatever society they found themselves.
Yeah, I remember that in the 60s, I actually can say a sentence like, I remember in the 60s, when the American writer Philip Roth would go to Eastern Europe and mourn the fact that this was the world where writing, no matter what it was not only political, but therefore relevant. And the mourning was for, having some kind of a push against the current events, and the mourning was for American literature, no matter how political, always being completely inconsequential in the larger realm. And so, it's in some ways it's a different reframing. It's a question of the circumstances make, Wisława Szymborska's modest poem about an apple being the most, explosive piece of writing that you can ever imagine. So it really isn't up to you to decide which of your work is going to become the revolutionary piece of writing that you will not know that you have produced. So, yeah.
And so, speaking as an educator in public schools and other schools, this is a very interesting point because we're at a stage of censorship in the schools. So we're talking about a lot of political poetry, and one wonders, what does that mean for the K through 12 students? Because, we're banning books, we're looking at racism in very conflictive ways. Sometimes I feel like we forget about younger people when we have these discussions. I really feel like there are all kinds of poetry that have meaning and healing elements. It doesn't have to always be a conflict, but I think there's a concern that this idea of communicating what's happening in the world is getting suppressed. I'd like to know your opinions of that.
Well, we have writers here who have to address those issues of censorship. Maybe you can frame it that way in your answers.
You want to go? Oh, you want me? I was like, do you want to go? I work a lot with children, and for me, at least my part of the writing, which I was here in this short piece, is that I'm talking about the conflict of choosing which poems. I'm definitely not talking, I'm not saying that there should be political, let's say in Indian syllabi in schools, they're still reading probably Wordsworth, but there's not enough space for Indian poets or Indian writers, and that is in a way slowly finding its way, and I was totally speaking from that kind of thing. And also, why would you choose a Billy Collins poem to a Wordsworth poem or some other person? That itself is a conflict. That's what I'm talking about, like the conflict of even arriving at a thing, of even making a syllabi for syllabus for schools. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but yeah, it is... I'm talking about that kind of conflict. Whatever as artists or people making syllabus, people teaching, there's a huge conflict of what I should bring to the children. That again is a huge cross of conflict for me. Yeah. In my mind, yeah.
The Iowa legislature is trying to make it so that these teachers have to put their entire year's curriculum online. And it has a lot to do with parents. So, I mean, I don't know if this kind of thing occurs in your countries, yeah. But it is happening here in Iowa, and it's kind of frightening.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying we often forget about school children because, in this panel, we're all writers, but when you look at the sort of literary industry, it's an ecosystem. It's readers, it's teachers, it's writers, it's publishers. So everyone is sort of putting in something to create that ecosystem. And I think part of that push would be to also kind of, from the grassroots, write letters, petition, ask to say, can we have this book? And one thing that helped me when I was in school is that there are certain books that weren't on my curriculum, but they were just in the library. And because they were just in the library, I had a chance to read them. So it seems like a small thing to do, but it does help. And in my country, it's a little bit different because it seems like here there's a push to say, you can teach this, you can't teach this. And in Zimbabwe, it's different in that You have some books that are kind of sponsored by the government, and those are, books that have to be Pan-African, have to be saying the West is bad. All our problems are because of the West. And then you have books that are sponsored by NGOs, and a lot of those books are people saying, the government is bad, all our problems are because of the government. And so actually, although I've kind of said I want to write about unicorns, being in the middle is itself a sort of like a hard place to be, because it's knowing that I'm not going to get easy sponsorship. So, what I said in the beginning, that we all have to realize we are part of an ecosystem and we all create it. So it's not just the writers. We could write all the books we want to write, but if you chose not to read them, we would be nothing, sort of. Yeah.
So it's hard to believe that actually the center is where the unicorn is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Midwest.
I'm very curious, because when you spoke, I met the tail end of your speech, but I read it, and the idea of writing about unicorns and black pain and trauma porn. I think what I'm curious about is somehow the refusal to also write about that. Does it not also? So it's like, okay, there's a way in which African literature is interpreted in the West, right? It might be trauma porn, Africana, or whatever it is, it's been labeled, and it's different from what it's how it's been interpreted back home, right? And so I'm wondering, I think what I'm wondering about is like that middle point, right? Like somehow a refusal to also say, I don't want it to be trauma porn, when that's the real situation on ground. Mm-hmm. Like it's that refusal I'm curious about. How do you negotiate that?
Yeah. So, okay, I think when I say a refusal, maybe I'm lying a little bit, because there are times when I do write about conflict, right? But it's also a little bit of it is about pandering. And so, for instance, how do I put this? I know what the situation in Zimbabwe looks like, right? But I also know that if I were to write a story about someone who had the worst sort of experience, my book would become a bestseller and I would win the Kane Prize and all of that. And I think that's where the sort of responsibility lies. For instance, if you think about the Ukraine war and how, sorry, I know I sound like I'm rambling, but if you think about the Ukraine war and you see how they've photographed a lot of the victims, you'll find that in the media you don't always see like dead white bodies or dead like white blood in the exact same way that you would see, for instance, if there was a bombing somewhere in Africa, they will show people's faces and people's bodies in a very dehumanizing way. And so part of that refusal for me isn't just saying that, oh no, I'm gonna act like this war never happened. No, I will touch on the war. But perhaps my touching on it will be from a human perspective and not just saying, oh, well, people were sexually assaulted and like people were killed, but actually as a human being who knows that perhaps my grandmother was alive in that time, how do I speak about it in such a way that I'm also respecting those people? If that makes sense.
Thanks for the panel, and some really interesting points here. Before I ask my question, I just want to set something straight, Felix. I believe I'm authority on this. I think unicorns eat rainbows. I don't think they eat humans. You're thinking about those Filipino demon horses who eat humans, but rainbows, rainbows and maybe kale. But I think that's. My question is, I think you all spoke to different degrees about you choose the conflict that you write about. And yeah, of course, conflict is necessary. I wonder why writers are hesitant, myself included, to write about conflict, is that if you write about it, do you feel that you need to take a side? And therefore, because you are unsure about your position, you don't write about it? So should a writer then examine their own bias and make that explicit? Or is good writing actually not taking a side and to present the conflict as neutrally, or is that journalism? How would each of you all approach that? So do you need to take a side or don't you? Is that what's the goal?
Yeah, I think like it could, I'm gonna put an example of my country. There's this poet. He's like from the left. In my country, the left is not like the left that you think about. It's like a capitalistic left. So it's not like, and yeah.
You're not seeing the difference, sorry.
Yeah. And well, his name is Luis Alberto Crespo. He's really good poet, and he like feed of the government a lot. Like this is like a secret thing, but in the literary world that is like super, super small in Venezuela, everyone knows it. Like he wrote Chavez speeches, so okay. And you can't deny that the poetry of, like his poetry is good. You can deny that. Even if you hate Chavez, you can deny that the poetry is good. But at the same time, I just think it depends on the writer. You know, you can write a good novel, a good poem that is, I don't know, like an ode or something to communism, and can be really good. And you can write a poem that is like really bad about communism. It depends on the quality of the writer, for me. But in most cases, I'm putting the example of poetry because I read more poetry than narrative. In Latin America, where the poets have like a political phase, like I don't know, like Neruda or Roque Dalton or some poets like that, the poetry becomes bad. You know, it's like, but at the same time, it's not like an statement. It's just that if you see history, that is what happens. But you like start asking questions why they wrote that poetry, and mostly in a lot of cases it's because they just needed the money, you know? And they just write like these poems for the government. So yeah, it's not like you can write about, you can be political and still be good writing, but I think like real literature looks at political conflicts with like delicacy and and it's subtle about it, but it's like just a personal opinion. So I don't know. I think that. Okay.
I always try to write the event with the victims side on the victims, like some people that have no power to do anything, and in the conflict, what I write is the structural violence by the government. Like the government have so much choice. They have choices to do it or not to do it, but the victims always have no choices. But yeah, it's always hard to try to do that because it's so complicated. Like we can see it as black and white, and because yeah, the things is always complicated. Yeah. But I try to write something on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think writers can pick a side. I think Ezra Pound and George Orwell quite famously picked sides.
Yeah.
I think for myself, it's because I live in a country where I've seen one side kind of do bad things and say, oh, well, the other side is doing bad things. And then the other side does bad things and they say, oh, well, they're doing bad things. And so it's kind of more of a, I won't say anarchy, but just kind of both of you have problems. So
because sometimes it's not really like he do the bad things and he's the bad people. Like in the Hollywood, like there's a bad people, he kills people and laughing. Like there's no other things in real life. They will have some excuse to do it. And yeah, everything is so complicated.
Yeah, and they all feel justified.
Yeah. Of course.
And they all want unicorns, so we'll take that as a place to stop. Thank you very much for this terrific panel discussion.